Thank you, Mr. President. To my colleagues, last week the Senate agreed to discharge our bipartisan war powers resolution from the Foreign Relations Committee so that we could finally, after months, debate military action against Venezuela and Venezuelans on the floor of the Senate, and not just allow the administration to wage combat on its own with no information shared except in classified settings. I thank my colleagues, two of whom are here on the floor today, who voted for this resolution. They did not vote to rebuke a president, although for some reason he's chosen to see it that way. Instead, they voted to uphold a basic constitutional principle that we should not be waging offensive hostilities without a debate and vote in Congress. As I described last week, the reason for that principle is clear. Don't send our sons and daughters into military hostilities without the debate and vote in Congress that would put the thumbprint of the nation's leadership on the validity of the mission. I believed that today we were going to have a debate about the War Powers Resolution, possibly consider amendments to it, and then hold a vote on final passage. But I now learn that some want to foreclose the possibility of a debate and allow the president to carry out this unauthorized campaign with no public debate and no vote. And they are apparently preparing a parliamentary move to deprive our resolution of the privileged status given it under the War Powers Resolution and thus shut debate down. First, an effort to declare this resolution not privileged, apparently by arguing that the campaign in and against Venezuelans is not hostilities, is something that the House has actually been doing, but the Senate should not emulate. Some of you remember that the Senate has passed a number of resolutions against President Trump's unilateral tariff taxes that are privileged. They're also privileged, or they used to be in the House, but the House was so afraid to even have a debate or vote about this matter that they used a procedural parliamentary trick to turn off the privilege. I don't think that is worthy of emulation by the greatest deliberative body in the world. We shouldn't be afraid to debate and discuss anything, especially matters of war and peace. Second, an argument that the Venezuela campaign is not imminent hostilities within the meaning of the War Powers Resolution is a violation of every reasonable meaning of that term. Let's begin with a boat campaign against boats with Venezuelans on it starting on September 2nd that have now killed more than 100 designated combatants. The amassing of U.S. military assets that the president calls an armada in and around Venezuela. The president's authorization of covert action in Venezuela. The United States military's use in the interdiction of oil from Venezuela. The attack over 2 weekends ago to seize the Venezuelan president, President Maduro, and his wife, where more than 100 combatants were killed, where U.S. troops were injured, and now ongoing control facilitated by the United States military. The United States is determining who can govern Venezuela. We've tapped the vice president of Venezuela and determined that she is somebody who should be the leader rather than the opposition who won an overwhelming election just a year ago. We have said we can determine when Venezuela will finally be entitled to have its own elections, saying that they're not going to be ready for that for some long period of time. We're seizing the nation's primary economic asset, its oil. We are deciding how the oil revenues, every penny of the oil revenues of this nation should be spent, and President Trump is even saying that he gets to determine which United States companies can even invest in the Venezuelan oil economy. And it's all being done with the active participation of the United States military. The U.S. military assets in place around Venezuela are, as President Trump said, an armada. 16,000 U.S. personnel, this is open source reporting as of 2 days ago, arrayed around Venezuela. the USS Gerald R. Ford Carrier Strike Group, Carrier Air Wing 9, the USS Winston Churchill, the USS Bainbridge, and the USS Mahan. The Iwo Jima Amphibious Readiness Group, which includes the USS Fort Lauderdale, the USS San Antonio, and the 22nd Marine Expeditionary Unit. The USS Thomas Hudner, DDG-116, the USS Stockdale, DDG-106, the USS Lake Erie, CG-70, the USS Gettysburg, CG-64, the USS Wichita, LCS-13, the USNS Waters, the USNS Joseph Humphreys, and the USNS Kanawha. And that's in addition to air assets that are arrayed all around the region that have been used and are likely to be used in the future. Everything that's being done to control Venezuela, its politics, and its economy are being facilitated by the United States military. But it's more than assets in place. Operation Southern Spear, the boat strikes of Venezuelan boats in international waters, is still being carried out by the United States military. The United States military is engaged in a naval blockade of Venezuela, transit out and transit in. Would we think that was an act of war if Russia was blockading the United States and not allowing commerce to come into or out of our ports? The U.S. military is engaged in active interdiction of Venezuelan oil in the Pacific and the Caribbean and elsewhere in the world, and the United States is threatening future military action. President Trump said about the Vice President Rodriguez, if she didn't act well, she would have a fate worse than President Maduro. President Trump was going to do a second invasion last Friday that he called off after our vote Thursday afternoon, threats of future invasion. If this is not imminent hostilities, with the death now of more than 200 combatants, with U.S. troops injured, with an armada arrayed around, and a naval interdiction of oil and a blockade of this country's economy, it would violate every reasonable meaning of this term, and to pretend otherwise would weaken the respect that this institution should aspire to. Finally, Mr. President, to my colleagues, there's been some recent correspondence between the chairman of the Senate Foreign Relations Committee, Senator Risch of Idaho, and the Secretary of State, Marco Rubio, that basically underline my point. Some Senate colleagues wanted to use this procedural maneuver today, and they felt that it would help if they could have a clear definition or description from the administration that the military operation is over. And so, Mr. President, I have the letter here that Senator Risch wrote to the President of the United States yesterday, and he asked two simple questions. First, provide Congress with an official correspondence confirming that Operation Absolute Resolve has ended. First request. And second, specify that, quote, U.S. military personnel are no longer involved in hostilities in Venezuela. Two simple questions. I don't know that those questions would have been sufficient for me, but apparently Senator Risch thought if he could get yes answers to both of those questions, it would be sufficient for him. Senator Rubio sent a response today and would not answer yes to either of the questions. The letter from Senator Rubio, dated earlier today, January 14, very explicitly does not say that Operation Absolute Resolve is over. He was asked to say it had ended. He would not say that it's ended. How could it be ended when the president is still threatening other sanctioned and indicted Venezuelan officials with a fate worse than Maduro's if they don't meet the U.S. standards? So in this letter, which my colleagues sought to justify their vote on this parliamentary maneuver that's coming up, Senator Rubio would not specify that the absolute resolve is ended. Well, how about the second question? Please specify that U.S. military personnel are no longer involved in hostilities in Venezuela. Secretary Rubio would not say that either. I quote, There are currently no U.S. armed forces in Venezuela. He didn't say U.S. forces aren't involved in hostilities in or against Venezuelans, because he couldn't say that with the interdiction, with the blockade, with the boat strikes. And so even the effort of my colleagues to try to find a parliamentary escape hatch, oh, there's no hostilities, and a softball set of 2 questions to the Secretary of State to justify their position produced a response where he would not agree that the operation is over, the military operation, and he would not agree that the U.S. is now not in hostilities in or against Venezuela. This is the 3rd vote we've had on Venezuela in the last 3 months. Only now does the administration and its supporters make the claim that there are no hostilities. They didn't make that claim in the first 2 months as the Armada was amassing, as we were killing people on open waters, as we were committing to covert action, as we were preparing and practicing for an invasion. They knew that it was hostilities, and that's why they didn't challenge it. But only now, on the 3rd vote, are they challenging whether this is or is not hostilities. And they're doing so to avoid public debate. That's the reason they're doing this. If this cause and if this legal basis were so righteous and so lawful, the administration and its supporters would not be so afraid to have this debate before the public and the United States Senate. For that reason, I urge my colleagues to avoid a parliamentary gag rule on discussion of this military operation and support the bipartisan War Powers Resolution. I yield the floor.